Hello, my name is John Cleveland, representing Power Up Lubricants. What we're going to demonstrate for you today is a product called Thixogrease made by Power Up. One of the products we're going to be demonstrating against is a lithium complex grease put out by a reputable manufacturer that costs somewhere between $5 and $6 a tube. Now this grease has an OK Timken rating of 100 pounds. I've explained in an earlier segment that this is a modified version of the OK Timken load test. And so this actual machine that we're going to test this grease on was actually designed for testing greases. So we're going to take this case-hardened Timken roller bearing. We've got a case-hardened race. We're going to make a dry run here. And to explain how this machine is set up is these are 1 pound weights, and for every weight that we put on here, we've got a fulcrum advantage of 35 to 1. So for every 1 pound is like putting 35 pounds of pressure on that bearing per square inch. But we're running on the size of a pinhead, and the engineers back at the Marion Laboratory tell me that on a new contact error on that race and on that bearing, these weights can actually represent over 7,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. So it doesn't take a lot of weight to get this bearing to seize up. Let me demonstrate. Okay, we've seized up at 4 weights dry. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this grease and we're going to cover the race. And I'm going to be very generous. We've got that race completely covered with grease. I want you to get a close-up on this race here, and I want you to notice that I've got grease all the way around the race and even in the center here. This is kind of how we test pressure and drip point. Now we're going to turn our roller bearing to a new spot. We've already seized up the bearing. So we're going to turn it to a new spot. Before we do that, let's take a look at the spot that we had so we have something to compare to. Okay, I'm turn the machine back on. We're running on a clear spot on the bearing now. I'm going to take the 4 weights off, and anything over 4 weights, we're going to attribute to the grease. This grease actually took 7 weights, which is pretty good. I'm going to turn the machine off. One thing I want you to pan up on is the bearing itself, and I want you to notice how much grease is actually protecting the bearing. There's very little grease actually on the bearing itself. And if you're looking for what I'm seeing, the grease is actually parted and allowed the metals to get into each other. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this right where it failed. And I'm going to add some Thixogrease. And this is kind of I'm just going to put some Thixogrease on my finger. I'm going to leave the 7 weights on here, and as this bearing is failing, I'm just going to rub a little Thixogrease right in the middle of the race, and I want you to listen to the difference. There's 2 reasons that I do it this way. One is to show you the compatibility of Thixogrease. Now basically, all we've done with the Thixogrease is we've added the Thixogrease into the center. I've left the red grease, and I coated the red grease on the inside of that race, so when we get this thing hot, we're going to demonstrate the drip point. We're running quiet and smooth. After we add the Thixogrease, we're also going to add some more weight. I'm actually going to double the load. We now have 14 weights. Now while this is heating up, I'm going to explain a little bit the difference between your aluminum complex and your lithium complex greases versus our grease. Your aluminum and lithium complex greases basically are about 85 to 90% soap, and then the soap is just a carrier for the additive package. Once these greases get hot, the additives can separate from the grease or the soap that is carrying the additives. The drip point on a lot of greases is somewhere around 350 to 400 degrees. So once they get heated up like that, the grease will leach out and you'll get separation from the additives. Power Up Thixogrease comes from the word, derived from the word thixotropic. Thixotropic means the ability to go from a liquid to a solid back and forth without losing consistency. It's also carried by calcium sulfonate. It's actually an over-based calcium sulfonate that can go from extreme heat to extreme cold without losing the consistency that it is right out of the tube. The drip point on Power Up Thixogrease is 570 degrees. And so we have seen our grease actually last 3 times longer in the bearing as some of your other greases. So it takes about 1 tube of Thixogrease to last the distance of 3 tubes of the other grease. Another thing that Thixogrease will do will take heat. You've already seen the red grease here is spun off. The Thixogrease is still protecting. We're running in excess of 400 degrees. We're about 432 degrees right now. Another thing Thixogrease can handle is extreme contamination. But before I contaminate it with water, I just want to shut this machine off real quick. You can see how hot that bearing is. I'm going to lift this up, and I'm just going to set this thing up here, and I want you to the camera to pan in on that, and I want you to see the surface of that bearing. It's completely covered in Thixogrease. Now, one of the proprietary ingredients of Thixogrease is our boundary lubricant. We also have retention agents. Power Up has a magnetic charge to metal surfaces, so when you get to extreme heat or high RPMs, the Thixogrease is right there covering the bearing. It's right there at the point of contact. At the bird's eye view, I'm looking right on top of the race, and all the grease is exactly in the center of the race at the point of contact. And that's the way we were able to keep those moving metals apart. We have good advanced fluid technology. We have good quality extreme pressure agents, and we have our proprietary boundary lubricants that work under severe loads without getting that metal-to-metal contact and excessive wear. Now, I'm going to put this back on here, and we're going to demonstrate one other quality of Thixogrease, and that's its resistance to water wash. We're still running at 14 weights, which is double the amount of pressure that we had with the lithium complex grease. We're going to add a cup here, and we're going to contaminate with some water. Now, resistance to water wash is very important in the marine industry, and it's also very important in wheel bearings, boat trailers, and things like that. In rainy situations or situations where you're running through water, when that grease comes in contact with water, you don't want that grease to separate. You don't want it to run out of the bearing. So let's add a little water and see what happens. Virtually no change at all. Power Up Thixogrease has excellent rust and corrosion inhibitors, excellent resistance to water wash, high temperature capability, high dropping point at 570 degrees, and a load carrying capacity of 200,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. Power Up Thixogrease is one of the best greases on the planet. Ford, Chrysler, General Motors, Boeing, and Bell Helicopter Owens Corning, all Fortune 500 companies rely on power-up Thixogrease to protect their bearings in their manufacturing facilities. The four-wheel drive shift on the flies are, the actuators are packed with power-up Thixogrease, and the Boeing and Bell helicopters and the rotor head assembly are also equipped with their bearings packed with power-up Thixogrease because it is the best protection that modern technology can provide. Thank you very much.